Okay, welcome back to your fourth HTML tutorial. In our previous tutorial, we created these two elements right here, our username and password. But in this tutorial, we're gonna create one HTML element, and we're gonna work on understanding the max length attribute, okay, and also the ID attribute. So let's take this out. We're gonna do this all over again. Okay, so let's go form. Okay, and within the form, our action is going to be the same page. Okay, our method this time is going to be get. Okay, now we're going to put in one HTML element, input element. Okay, so input. Okay, type. Our type will be text. Okay, our name, let's just call it um, txt box. Our ID, let's call it ELEM1, and let's put in another attribute, which is max length. Okay, now our max length attribute tells the browser how many characters to allow the user to input into the form field. So let's put in 4 characters. Okay, let's save this and run it in our browser. Localhost / index.php. Now let's type in some characters here. You see, it only accepts up to 4 characters. So our max length attribute tells the browser only allow the user to input up to 4 characters. Okay, let's take this out. Let's put 10. Control S. Let's go back to our browser. Save. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, it's only going to allow us to input up to 10 characters right here. Okay, let's go back to this. Let's put in a button. Let's call it type equals submit. Okay, and let's give it ID as well. Let's call it btn. Okay, now I want to explain the ID attribute further. The ID attribute of the text input right here, and also the ID attribute of the button, submit button right here. Now the ID attribute, you could use CSS to manipulate the text box and the button using the ID element here, and you could also use JavaScript to manipulate the text box and the button using the ID element. But we're going to use CSS. We don't want to get too much into CSS at the moment, but because we're gonna do that further along the line. But first of all, to grab onto the text box right here, we grab onto its ID. Now to grab onto its ID, we use the pound sign, right? And then we give it the name of the ID, which is in fact ELEM1. Okay, open curly braces, and within the curly braces, we're going to say what we want to do with this text box. We want to give it let's say we want to give it a width. We want to make the width of the text box longer. Okay, so we go width. Let's call it 300 px. 300 px meaning 300 pixels in length. Let's save this and run this in a browser. Refresh. As you can see here, the width of the text box just increased to 300 pixels. Okay, we could also increase the height of the text box. Okay, the height, let's call it 30px. Control S. Let's go back into our browser. You see, and we increase the height 30px. Okay, now as you can see here, the text within the text box is quite small. We could increase the text as well. So we could say font size. We could say, let's call it 18px. So this is going to increase the size of the font. Save it, Control S. Let's go back to our browser, and as you can see, our text has just increased. Okay, now we need to look at this button is quite small. We need to increase the size of this button as well. Okay, so we can use the ID element, the ID attribute of the button, the submit button here, and go out to our CSS, and we go ID, which is btn. Okay, so we go ID btn, open curly brackets, close curly brackets, and we're gonna say our height will be let's call it 32px. Okay, so we Control S to save. We refresh this. See how it increased its height to 32. We can make it a little bigger. Let's call it 36. Control S. Okay, you see you made it just as big as the text box right here. Okay, and we could even increase the width as well. Let's call it 80px. Control S to save. Let's go back to the browser. Okay, we made it bigger as well. So this is our text box that we can manipulate using simply the ID right here, and we can also manipulate the button element using its ID attribute as well. Okay, now this will be a very short tutorial. We have more tutorials, and like I said, we're gonna go in depth with CSS with further tutorials, but for now we simply want to concentrate on the input element, the use of its ID attribute, and also the max length, which prevents the users from entering many characters. Okay, we limit them to how many characters we want the users to enter. Okay, so thank you for watching, and please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.